The Vietnam War started in 1955 and lasted till 1975. It was fought between the formerly democratic South Vietnamese government with the support of the United States and the nationalist communist forces in North Vietnam, who were sided by the Viet Congs in South Vietnam. This video will focus on the events of the war itself. To learn more about the background and what led to the war, you can watch our previous video. After the end of the First Indochina War, there was less than a year before the Second Indochina War, as known as the Vietnam War, began. During the time between wars, Vietnam was divided into two, North and South Vietnam. During the First Indochina War, the French forces in South Vietnam had previously been supported by the United States. US interference in Vietnam. The official involvement of the US in the Vietnam War started in 1955 when President Dwight David Eisenhower sent military advisors to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The military interference was justified by the domino theory, which stated that one country falling under the influence of communism would spread the regime to neighboring states. Operation Passage to Freedom. After the First Indochina War in 1954, many Vietnamese people wanted to leave the North and start a new life in South Vietnam. The French had expected this to happen, however, they were not prepared to provide food and shelter to the over 200,000 people who had arrived in Hanoi and Haiphong in order to escape to South Vietnam. The French government's first concern was getting their own military out of the north, so taking care of the refugees and transporting them proved to be very difficult. The French asked Washington for assistance, and so the US Department of Defense ordered the US Navy to mobilize an evacuation task force. The American government saw this as an opportunity to weaken the communists by evacuating refugees to South Vietnam and thereby draining the communist population base. The US also ran a propaganda campaign in North Vietnam in order to increase the amount of people heading south. This campaign mostly revolved around spreading false rumors. Northern Catholics were the main target because of their anti-communist tendencies. This campaign accordingly tripled the refugee registration. The Viet Minh did engage in counter-propaganda by telling the people in the north that the Americans and the French would torture and kill them if they wanted to go south, but they weren't as successful as the United States. By the end of the operation, the US Navy had transported around 300,000 refugees to South Vietnam. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing President Lyndon B. Johnson to take any measures he believed necessary to maintain the international peace and security in Southeast Asia. This provided the justification for further US involvement in the Vietnam conflict. At first, Johnson didn't want to escalate the war if it were not absolutely necessary. He reassured the US people that they won't send troops to fight the South's war. As he stated on October 21, 1964, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." Lyndon B. Johnson campaigned on a peace platform. However, he was preparing a contingency in case the situation got worse, and that it did, as Ho Chi Minh had no intention of negotiating with the US. This resulted in Lyndon B. Johnson authorizing Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was the codename for a major American bombing campaign during the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1965 to 1968. This bombardment was intended to militarily pressurize North Vietnam's communist leaders and therefore reduce their capacity to wage war on South Vietnam's US-supported government. A total of 864,000 tons of American bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. At first, airstrikes were restricted to the southern part of North Vietnam, but in order to put more pressure on North Vietnam's government, the US eventually moved the target area steadily northward. Despite the fact that North Vietnam didn't have a very developed air force, they still managed to effectively defend themselves. With help from China and the Soviet Union, the North Vietnamese set up an advanced air defense system. Shortly after Operation Rolling Thunder began in 1965, Johnson sent the first US ground troops to the war, composed of 3,500 US Marines. On July 28, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced his decision to send an additional 50,000 troops to South Vietnam, alongside saying that the monthly draft call would double from 17,000 to 35,000 young men per month. By 1966, The number of troops sent into Vietnam was 385,000. In the face of rising manpower needs, the United States Department of Defense would initiate a controversial program called Project 100,000, which would significantly reduce the recruitment standards for the US military. This meant that soldiers that previously were not fit for military service would now be able to join. The project had been the subject of controversy and was finally ended in 1971. Such a large-scale involvement sparked anti-war sentiments in the public. The anti-Vietnam War movement began in 1965 by the time US planes had begun regular bombings of North Vietnam, when some critics started to question the government's claim that it was fighting the democratic war to liberate the South Vietnamese people from communist aggression. The vocal minority that was against the war included mostly students, intellectuals and hippies, because they were the ones who would receive draft calls. Many people tried avoiding the draft notice, which could result in a fine and being arrested. A notable example is Muhammad Ali. He was supposed to go fight in Vietnam, but was strongly against the entire war. I will say directly, no, I will not go 10,000 miles to help kill innocent people. He postponed his entire boxing career, but inspired many to stand against the entire drafting process. By November 1967, American troop count in Vietnam was nearing 500,000, and US casualties were ever growing. The Vietnam War was costing the United States about $25 billion per year, which became apparent to more and more of the tax-paying public. This caused the anti-war movement to grow even more. On October 21, 1967, one of the most important anti-war demonstrations took place, as some 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. 30,000 of them continued in a march on the Pentagon later that night. There, hundreds of protesters were arrested after a brutal confrontation with the soldiers and US Marshals protecting the building. Also in 1967, the anti-war movement got a significant boost when the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. expressed his opposition to the war on moral grounds. On March 25, 1967, he even called the Vietnam War a blasphemy against all that America stands for. In the year of 1969, the American rock band Creedence Clearwater Revival published one of the most famous anti-war songs of all time, Fortunate Son. It was inspired by the stark contrast between those who were drafted to fight and die for their country, and those who had the privilege to avoid the draft because of their wealth and connections. The English songwriter John Lennon created a couple of songs about the Vietnam War, like Happy Xmas, War is Over, and the timeless classic Imagine, in collaboration with his wife Yoko Ono. However, the protests soon became a global movement as they began to take place in other countries such as England and France. On March 17, 1968, about 10,000 people in London demonstrated against American involvement in Vietnam. Protests were also held in Australia, as between 1962 and 1972, around 60,000 Australian defence personnel were sent to Vietnam, meaning they had an active involvement in the war. The sending of Australian personnel was mostly to strengthen ties with the US, but as the war dragged on, the public's support for the war decreased. This resulted in moratoriums and other protests being held, with the objective to get the government to withdraw Australian troops from Vietnam. Moratorium meaning a halt to business as usual. The Vietnam War consisted of many different US operations and battles, which will now be explained. Operation Ranch Hand was a codename for the spraying of herbicides in Southeast Asia from 1962 throughout 1971. During these years, the US Air Force sprayed around 20 million gallons of herbicide and defoliants. Agent Orange was the most commonly used and the most potent herbicide in Vietnam. It contained the deadly chemical dioxin, which is mainly a byproduct of industrial practices. The purpose of using herbicides was to remove the vegetation cover used for concealment and to deprive the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops from food. The impact of Agent Orange and other herbicides will be explained in the next part. Battle of Khe Sanh began on January 21st, 1968, when the People's Army of North Vietnam carried out a large bombardment on the US Marine garrison at Khe Sanh in South Vietnam near the border with Laos. The garrison was besieged by the North Vietnamese in the process. As a counterattack, US and South Vietnamese forces launched Operation Niagara, a major artillery bombardment of suspected locations of North Vietnamese artillery in the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. The siege of the garrison went on for an entirety of 77 days, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. In April of 1968, the siege was eventually broken and US forces continued operations in the area, but the Khe Sanh combat base was destroyed. As US President Lyndon Johnson, General William Westmoreland, and other officials considered Khe Sanh to be the main target of the North Vietnamese, they mostly ignored signs of communist buildup in urban areas of South Vietnam. However, they would soon come to regret this, with the start of a new military campaign, the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War. It was launched by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese People's Army of Vietnam on January 30th, 1968 against the forces of the South Vietnamese Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the United States Armed Forces and their allies. It was a campaign of surprise attacks against military and civilian command and control centers throughout South Vietnam. The name is the shortened version of the Lunar New Year's festival's name in Vietnamese, Tet Nguyen Dan. The offense was chosen during the holiday period because most ARVN personnel were on leave. The purpose of the wide-scale offensive was to trigger political instability in a belief that mass armed assault on urban centers would trigger an uprising that would bring upon the end of the South Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong were able to take control of a few cities in the beginning, but Allied forces were able to regroup and inflict heavy casualties on the Viet Cong. The offensive was a military defeat for North Vietnam. However, the offensive shook the US public, as they had been led to believe by the US government that the North Vietnamese were losing and that they were incapable of launching such an aggressive offensive. As a result of the casualties of the Tet Offensive, US support for the war greatly decreased. United States Army General William Westmoreland said that defeating the Viet Cong would require 200,000 more American soldiers and activation of the reserve. This prompted even the most loyal supporters of the war to question the current war strategy. The Battle of Hue began on January 31st, 1968, after Viet Cong forces were able to occupy the city of Hue during the Tet Offensive. They set up provisional authorities who were tasked with removing the existing government administration from power in the city. Following the initial hours of the attack, many people were rounded up. These people included ARVN soldiers, civil servants, school teachers, American civilians, and many more. Viet Cong used loudspeakers to gather these people, and those who did not report voluntarily were hunted down. Most who were rounded up were never seen again. Dozens of mass graves were found around the city of Hue, and it is estimated that the death toll was between 2,800 and 6,000. After the end of Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency on January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon became president. In the same year, Nixon announced a foreign policy called the Nixon doctrine, by which the US would support allies facing military threats with economic and military aid rather than with ground troops. The reason behind it was said to be the United States being unable to afford fully defending its allies. Nixon created the doctrine because of the tremendous strain the Vietnam War put on US resources. In the spring of 1969, President Richard Nixon launched Operation Menu, which consisted of top-secret bombings on the little-known country Cambodia. The bombings were carried out with the intention of stopping North Vietnam from shipping troops and supplies to South Vietnam through Cambodia. The American public was never informed of these bombings. In fact, the missions were so well guarded that even the pilots flying the planes didn't know what they were bombing. During the fights, over 2.7 million tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia, which was more than 5 times the amount of what the US used against Japan in World War II. The bombings were at first considered a success, delaying the fall of certain areas to the Communist Party of Kampuchea and also pushing the North Vietnamese troops further into Cambodia. The wins, however, came at a remarkable cost, killing between 50,000 to 200,000 Cambodian civilians. Operation Lam Son 719, or Ninth Route, Southern Laos Campaign. The campaign was carried out by the armed forces of South Vietnam between the 8th of February and 25th of March 1971. It was conducted in the southeastern portion of the Kingdom of Laos. The United States ground forces were prohibited by law from entering Laotian territory, so they provided logistical, aerial, and artillery support. The goal of the operation was to disrupt possible future offensives by the People's Army of Vietnam. They launched a preemptive attack against the PAVN's long-established logistical system in the hopes that a quick victory in Laos would boost the morale and confidence of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. However, due to the PAVN and the Viet Cong's intelligence and preparation beforehand, Operation Lam Son 719 collapsed when faced by the determined resistance of the PAVN and Viet Cong. The campaign demonstrated continued deficiencies in ARVN military leadership, destroying the confidence that had been built up over the previous years. The Easter Offensive was a military campaign launched by the People's Army of Vietnam against the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the United States military. The offensive lasted from March 30th till the 22nd of October 1972. It was a very large offensive, with the North Vietnamese army attacking with over 300,000 soldiers. They wanted to achieve a decisive victory. The US were expecting an attack in 1972, but the offensive was so aggressive and large that the defenders were caught off balance. The North attacked from 3 different fronts at the same time. This was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's first attempt to invade the South since the Tet Offensive of 1968. The US also conducted a bombing campaign called Operation Linebacker, which was meant to slow the transportation of materials and supplies for the Easter Offensive. As a result of the offensive, the South was able to withstand the attack. However, North Vietnam accomplished a few important goals. Mainly, they gained some territory in South Vietnam from which to launch future offensives. They were also able to obtain a better bargaining position at the Paris peace negotiations, as both sides were more open to make concessions. The Paris peace negotiations were conducted between the fighting sides in Paris to resolve the conflict. However, the US wouldn't accept North Vietnamese demands to force the South Vietnamese president Nguyen Van Thieu to resign. This led to the peace talks collapsing on December 13th. US President Nixon was infuriated by how the negotiations were going, so he retaliated by ordering Operation Linebacker II in hopes to convince North Vietnam to rejoin the peace negotiations. Linebacker II was the last major military operation conducted by the US. This campaign was also referred to as the Christmas bombings, as it lasted from December 18th to December 29th, 1972. They bombed military and industrial areas in Hanoi and Haiphong. These bombings resulted in 1,624 civilian deaths. As a result, North Vietnam was willing to continue peace talks. The Paris Peace Accords, officially the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. The peace talks began back in May 1968, but little progress was made until the end of Operation Linebacker II 4 years later. The treaty was signed on January 27, 1973, to end the Vietnam War and establish peace in Vietnam. The treaty included the governments of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, the United States, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. The PRG represented the views of the South Vietnamese Communists. The accords resulted in the withdrawal of all US troops from Vietnamese territories and the release of all prisoners of war. Immediate ceasefire was also agreed upon. However, it ended up being temporary because it only lasted for less than a day, as fighting began almost immediately after the agreement, and by March 1973, all-out war had resumed. Nixon had secretly promised President Thieu that he would support the South Vietnamese with air power if necessary. The US Congress approved the Case Church Amendment, which prohibited further US military activity in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, unless the president secured congressional approval in advance. During this time, however, Nixon was being driven from office because of the Watergate scandal. This eventually led to his resignation in 1974. The North Vietnamese began their final offensive early in 1975, but the US Congress refused to aid South Vietnam as there was strong public opposition against the war and Nixon wasn't there to convince them otherwise. Hue subsequently resigned, accusing the US of betrayal in a TV and radio address. Is an American's word reliable these days? The United States did not keep its promise to help us fight for freedom, and it was in the same fight that the United States lost 50,000 of its young men. Fall of Saigon. On the 30th of April 1975, the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong were able to conquer the capital city of South Vietnam. This event is also called the Liberation of Saigon or the Liberation of the South, as this marked the end of the Vietnam War and the collapse of the non-communist regime. Vietnam would now be under communist rule, with the official name being the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Almost all American civilians and military personnel were evacuated. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians who were associated with the democratic regime were also evacuated. The official involvement of the US in the Vietnam War started in 1955 during Dwight David Eisenhower's presidency and was justified by the domino theory. After the First Indochina War ended in 1954, many North Vietnamese people wanted to relocate to South Vietnam. The French weren't able to evacuate all of the civilians, so they asked the United States for assistance, which they received in the form of the US Navy mobilizing an evacuation task force. In 1964, the US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed Lyndon B. Johnson to take any measures he thought necessary in the Vietnam conflict. Operation Rolling Thunder was a large-scale US bombing campaign from 1965 to 1968 with the intention of reducing the North Vietnamese military's fighting capacity. Shortly after the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, the first ground troops were sent to Vietnam. The number of soldiers increased in the following years, and by 1966, the number of troops sent into Vietnam was 385,000. US activity in Vietnam sparked anti-war movements in the US, which later spread to other countries. The protesters were mostly people who would receive draft goals. Some notable examples of who were against the war were Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lennon. Operation Ranchan lasted from 1962 throughout 1971. It entailed the spraying of herbicides and defoliants to remove the vegetation cover in Vietnam, thereby reducing the enemy's food sources. The Battle of Khe Sanh was a large bombardment on the US garrison at Khe Sanh on January 21, 1968. The base was besieged and destroyed by the North Vietnamese. This caused the heads of the US military to believe that Khe Sanh was the main target of the enemy, thus ignoring signs of a communist build-up in urban areas of South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive began on January 30, 1968, when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese military launched multiple surprise attacks against South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese suffered numerous casualties, but were able to spook the US public, who believed that their government had the situation under control. When Nixon became president, he announced the Nixon doctrine, which implied that the US would support allies under military threat with economic and military aid rather than with ground troops. Operation Menu was a secret bombing campaign in which over 2.7 million tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia. It was successful in delaying the fall of certain areas to communists, but it caused the death of 50,000 to 200,000 Cambodian civilians. Operation Lam Son was a failed ARVN mission which was supported by the US. They launched attacks on the PAVN's logistical system. However, the operation collapsed when faced by the enemy's firm resistance. This destroyed the confidence of the ARVN's military leadership. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a military campaign against the ARVN, with the PAVN attacking from 3 different fronts with over 300,000 soldiers. As a result, the North Vietnamese were able to improve their position in the Paris peace talks. The treaty was signed on January 27, 1973. It included both of the fighting sides and resulted in the withdrawal of all US troops from Vietnamese territories and the release of all prisoners of war. On the 30th of April 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam was occupied by the communists. This marked the end of the Vietnam War and the non-communist regime. This video talked about the events of the war. The third and final video will give an overview of what happened after the war. Thank you for watching.